Hello everyone, my name is Catherine and I'm World from World of Writing. Today I'll be talking about some tips I have on outlining a sequel because that's what I'm starting doing and I have been thinking about it for a little while. But before we start the video, like and subscribe if you like this video. Also, go follow me on my Instagram, World of Writing, to see writing tips and writer fun content. Okay, let's jump into the video. So, one of the first things I did when I was starting to outline a sequel was think of different ways I wanted to outline it. I tried doing sticky notes up on my wall, I tried doing the 3-act structure, and a couple of things worked. The two things I just mentioned helped me with getting a basis for the main plot, so I have all of my main plot points, but I couldn't really find a way to put in my subplots with these methods, so I'm trying the outlining like J.K. Rowling. Soon it'll be up in my next video to get my subplots rolling. So I think when you're outlining, one of the best things is to find a method that works for you because different methods work for everyone. Now specifically for outlining a sequel, I think a good first thing to do is a thought dump or a wish list. This is important because you can get your ideas out on paper and you can decide, okay, so I have these couple of scenes that I want. So for example, on your wish list or your thought dump, you might have a couple of scenes on there that are for your subplots, and that just reminds you have to put those in, so you'll be thinking about your subplots, and it'll just, you might look back at something and be like, oh, that's what I was thinking for this scene, and I just totally forgot about that. But then you'll remember it, and it's fun to do, and it gets your mind rolling about that certain book or topic, so it can't hurt, right? Specifically for a sequel, I think something that can really help is if you have an outline from your first book, looking at that and writing down which ends were tied up, which ends were left open, what do you need to continue working on in the next book, and what are you going to leave in the first book. Something that is left open, you need to continue. You might need to reread where you were in your last scene of the subplot that's left open, or even if it's not a subplot, even if it's just something in the main plot that was left open, you might want to reread over the last scene that has to do with that topic so you can remember it, because it's not like a normal book where you just, oh, I'm going to start and then keep going. You have to be like, oh, what am I picking up, what am I adding, and what is staying behind? Because certain things will stay behind. Certain characters will stay behind. Certain topics will stay behind. You might change your theme in the second book. I'm going to have a continuous theme, but the first book has a smaller theme that stays in the first book, and the second book will also have a smaller theme that stays in the second book, and they both have an overarching theme that goes for both of them. So things like that, you might want to think about your theme. Just some stuff stays in the first book, some stuff carries over to the second book, and you're going to need to add things in the second book. So that's good to think about when you are working on a sequel. Or any series, really. This can work for a sequel or a series. I happen to be doing a sequel, and I'm not doing another book after this one, but if you're using a series, that totally works for a series too. Another thing you have to think about when you're outlining a series or a sequel is what can't you do? I know this seems counterintuitive because you're thinking about what are you going to do, what can you do, that kind of thing. But if you're thinking, oh, for example, I want to add a romantic subplot between these two people, but in the first book, they hate each other, you can't just jump in and have them, have a romantic subplot. Now, had you laid the groundwork for that in the first book and they were close friends or something, yeah, you can. Or if they did hate each other in the first book, you can put in the second book that they hate each other and then they grow to like each other and then have a romantic subplot. But if you just jump right into it, you have to think about things like that. What was your magic system in the first book? I know you kind of have to think about that when you write a first book, but you can change things in the first book when you're writing. But in a second book, you can't just change the magic system. You've already written it in. It has to say, more or less the same. You can have a new rule be discovered or a way to break a rule be discovered, but if you just change the rules, people are going to know because you already wrote the first book, unless you go and change them in the first book, which is totally fine. If you discover that you want to do something in the second book that you didn't plan for or allow in your first book, you can totally go change something in your first book. That's not against the rules. There aren't really many rules with writing. So, what can you do? Obviously, because you're outlining, and what can't you do is very important for when you're trying to write a sequel or when you're outlining or writing the first bit of your sequel. You have to also think about that if you're going to give it out to readers. Even if you're not, it's still good to think about it because that's just, you might not be writing for anyone to read it, but you gotta practice, right? if you think about it, if you had done something with this book and published it or whatnot, most people won't be reading them right after each other. They won't read the first book and then the next day pick up the second book. You know, it might be a while. If you're publishing, it might be a year before you publish the second book. It might be, you know, just a couple months, something like that. But you gotta think about that. So when you write your first chapter, if you pick up with all the characters, assuming that people know exactly who you're talking about and everything, now, sure, they'll have a little bit of people knowing them. You're not gonna have your main character re-meet them again or anything. But, you know, have them, maybe somebody new walks in and they introduce themselves and they tell them what they're doing, not their role in the story, but if they have a role, if they have a job or something, you know, they might tell that person what their job is. Something important that they told your main character when your main character first met them. You have someone else to walk in, a new character maybe, because it's great to add new characters, and they introduce themselves again. It's a great way for the reader to kind of get caught up and remembered without info dumping. Another thing, this might not apply to every book, but it might apply to a lot of them. For example, it applies to my book, and I know there are other books like mine that it would apply to. Think about what your character already knows. If your main character, for example, if you're writing a fantasy and you have a magic system, and your main character already knows the rules of the magic system, maybe they learned them in the first book, maybe they just already knew them before the series started. If they know those rules, you can't have someone tell the main character those rules again. It doesn't add up. You can't have the main character relearn things if they've already learned it in the first book. Yeah, in the first book it might have made sense that they didn't know everything and they had to learn it. Now, and I'm not saying they know everything now either, but there are things that they know now because they've been through a book in your world. They understand a lot about your world now. The reader understands maybe not everything, but a good bit about your world now. Sure, you might want to remind them, but that doesn't mean your main character needs to relearn everything. If you can get creative with other ways to tell the reader, like remind them of your magic system or something, that's a great idea. But you don't have to do all of this in the first chapter. I mean, yeah, you might want to reintroduce some things and remind your readers, remind people about your world and characters and other things about your story. But you don't have to do it all in the first chapter, because you don't want the first chapter to just be an info dump. You can do it in the early stages of the book, before everything gets chaotic, obviously, because your climax is going to pick up soon. I know I've said this a lot, and you gotta remember, your readers remember things from the first book, and they expect things because of the first book. If you ended the first book with your characters going on a certain journey, I mean, yeah, you don't have to have that journey be the second book. You could be years later in the second book. But you gotta remember, those years passed. The main characters remember it, and that's what your readers left off on. So, if you skip 5 years in the future, you might want to say you skipped 5 years in the future. You know, if you're making a big plot twist in the second book and their entire world is changing, it should happen in the second book. Because if everything about the world, if the magic system changes between the first book and the second book, people are going to be confused. I'm not saying you can't do that. I'm saying if you do that, you got to tell the readers. And it helps the readers if you start somewhat where they're expecting. You can take the book in a totally different direction, or you can take it where they're expecting, or you can do both. But if you start a place that they don't understand, but you're using it as a sequel, it might get a little confusing. So just keep that in mind. Now, when it gets to actually outlining, pen to paper, outlining your sequel, I honestly don't think that much is going to change. I, for one, am doing a different method than I did for my first book, because I tried doing what I did for the first book a couple of days ago, and it just wasn't working for me. Partly because this was a sequel and I needed to think about it a bit more than I did my first book. I couldn't just kind of start like, oh, I want this scene here and that scene there. I had to do it in a little more of an order so that I could get the basis. I'm sure I can, like right now, I can do the last chapters if I wanted to, but I've also done the first 5 chapters by now. When I was thinking about it this morning, I couldn't have started outlining the middle, just because I had to think about, where am I starting? What are the paths for this book? Because if you stopped writing the first book and you are now picking up the second book later, or you stopped writing the second book and you're picking up the third book, etc., etc., you have to remind yourself of what happened. You kind of have to, even if you're a pantser, if you're trying to sort of just, okay, I remember this character and that thing, I'm just going to kind of start writing, it doesn't work as well for sequels, because they have to follow the track you set in the first book. And not to the T, they can go off the track and you can throw in a plot twist or two. Totally up to you, but, there are rules in your world now. You've laid down the groundwork for your world. You've laid down the groundwork for your character. You've even set expectations for your plot. So I would, even if you're a pantser, if you're a true pantser, do what works for you, don't get me wrong, but I would suggest plotting just a little bit more than you usually do for a book for the sequel, because it has more rules and expectations to do with it than jumping into a first book or a standalone. It's editing me. Hi. Just a little disclaimer, this is all tips. I'm not saying you have to do any of this, and I know I said can't a lot in here. You can do anything you want to do. I'm just recommending, and the way when I'm talking about things, that's just how I talk, but I'm not saying you have to do any of this. I'm not saying you have to listen to me. Totally do your own thing. This is just my tips, my recommendations, things that I've thought of that I think would help when writing a sequel to a series. So, yeah, thanks for watching. Okay, so that's all for today. Thank you for watching. Give this video a big thumbs up if you enjoyed, and hit that subscribe button, because I'll be posting more videos like this, and I'll be posting a series on outlining a sequel. So if you want to see that, you should totally subscribe. I will see you soon in my next video, or if you follow me on Instagram @WorldOfWriting, I will see you sooner there. Bye.